Well, as well as questions over the future of Jeremy Corbyn, the Conservative Party beginning the process now of deciding who will be their next leader and ultimately, therefore, Prime Minister. Who could replace David Cameron? Here's Claudia Lisa at the screen.
Thank you, Colin. Well, looking at the favourites, the next Prime Minister could come from either side of the Europe debate. Much of the speculation, though, focuses on this man, Boris Johnson, the MP for Uxbridge and the former Mayor of London, the leading voice in the Leave campaign. But there's some suggestion that Theresa May might be a good candidate to be a caretaker leader. But she's not a Brexiteer, which many Tory MPs who voted to leave may just want. Next up, we've got the Chancellor, George Osborne. Now, his name has long been seen by many as the natural successor to David Cameron, but after yesterday's events, he may no longer be in the running. Now, another leading female candidate could be the Employment Minister, Priti Patel. Now, she defied David Cameron on the issue of Europe, but she's refused to be drawn on the issue of leadership. Next up, Sky sources are also hearing the Secretary of State for Education, Nicky Morgan, has been talking to people about whether it's appropriate to stand for the leadership. But Michael Gove's name has been mentioned too. But the Justice Minister and Vote to Leave campaigner has repeatedly said he's not interested in the job. And finally, we've got these two men, the Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, and Stephen Crabb, the Work and Pensions Secretary, are among the less well-known candidates. Mr Javid is the son of a bus driver and was educated at a comprehensive school, so might make a change from the usual face of the leadership, while Stephen Crabb's background would also be a change from the norm for a Tory leader. Raised by a single mother on a council estate in Wales, he worked on a building site before going into politics. So there you have it. Whoever it is, they'll have to reunite the Conservative Party after a long and divisive referendum campaign.
Phillip Blond is a former advisor to David Cameron, regular contributor on Sky News, joins us now. When we were running the clip from Lord Hill, our man in Brussels, you grimaced ever so slightly and suggested he ought to have hung on.
Yeah, I think it was a grave miscalculation. I mean, I think, look, it's not over. We already have the leading campaigners who argued for Brexit saying, well, we're going to pause before we trigger Article 50. The European Union can't force us to trigger Article 50. It's down to the British government. It's also not clear if Parliament's consent is required. And then in Parliament, the majority of MPs there, the overwhelming majority, do not favour rupturing ties with the European Union.
But there'd be open revolt if it was dismissed by parliamentarians.
Well, I actually suspect there may well be a second referendum. Now, it could quite likely become in the form of a general election. If we are going to have a new Conservative Prime Minister come party conference, he or she will, I think, want to establish their democratic legitimacy and mandate very quickly. And in effect, I suspect they will have on their agenda a new offer from Europe. But also they're likely to face a Labour Party that I suspect will stand on reversing Brexit. Now, for example, if we have that and if Labour Party win the general election, that's the latest democratic mandate for not following through with Brexit. So I think we're going to face a popular public test. Now, what I would advise is that actually Europe stops this insane pressure. Europe feels very bruised and very hurt, but actually Europe itself isn't working. The euro is a disaster. They're facing military threats from radical Islam in the south, Russia in the east, mass migration.
How can Europe feel bruised and hurt? I mean, some people say this is a problem of their own begetting.
They feel, and now I understand that Britons don't feel this, but Europeans feel they have bent over backwards to create a special deal that nobody else has in Europe, and the Brits have rejected them. It's rather like a spurned, friend,
Future.
Really. And actually, if they just, and Merkel is, for once, being wise and saying, let's not press this. Europe needs...
She should have given more, though, shouldn't she? Merkel should have...
If Merkel had given Cameron more and created a deal on free movement, then I think Cameron would have won this referendum. Because if you look at the concerns of those who voted for Brexit, number one, above economic criteria and economic crash, is fear of migration. And the enormous scale of migration is destabilising for any country. And the European Union has to recognise that if you've got millions literally going into one country that's actually economically doing well, that's not right. So I think there could be, in the near future, a new offering on free movement. Now, if we have free movements, a new offer, that's a material change that could, I would argue, should.
You're borrowing the language of the SNP's manifesto here, aren't you? This idea of a trigger being a material
but
change
you
in
see,
circumstances.
I think Nicola Sturgeon has a good case in point. You know, Scotland is a devolved nation, and I understand
the Scots
the
voted to
argument.
remain by 62% to 38%. In Britain, the arithmetic was... In England and Wales, the arithmetic was very different.
It's very different, so it's more fragile. So I think, look, what we don't have is what are the terms on which Brexit takes place? We don't know. We don't yet and can't tell the economic and social and business costs.
But that's why the Tories will choose a new leader.
They will choose a new leader, but that new leader, in my view, will has two options. He or she could go with the vote, absolutely, that's legitimate. I suspect if they go with the vote as is, they may well face a Labour Party that actually says part of our manifesto commitments is to remain in Europe and reject Brexit. Or what they may do, if they're being clever and visionary, is strike a new bargain with Europe on migration and say, look, we can now offer to the British people a further exception on migration. And it may well be that we will get a majority vote for that.
Just to be clear, Philip, you are suggesting there could be a Tory leader who would be Prime Minister who would not invoke Article 50.
Absolutely,
He'd
I'm
be
suggesting
torn limb from limb.
I don't necessarily think so.
Or she?
Well, we've already had Boris Johnson, who I would argue is not really a Brexiteer, who was on record of saying we need perhaps to have a second referendum, who's on record of saying, I don't feel we should go out. If he, for example, becomes Tory leader and he gets a material change and a material offer, it wouldn't surprise me if that was once more put to the electorate. Now, I'm not suggesting that this should be imposed by Parliament. Absolutely not. I think it's got to be the subject of another national referendum. But what I'm saying is the fat lady hasn't stopped singing on
some
this.
Some people who are not that politically engaged or hitherto haven't been will feel this is the elite again, trying to pull the wool over their eyes. They'll see, for instance, an e-petition with more than 1 million people's names on it right now calling for a second referendum. And they'll see evidence that some people genuinely seem to think that their vote is worse than other people's votes. And that's not how democracy is meant to work.
I believe in democracy, and I think we should respect the referendum. But I think
you've just said we should dismiss it.
No, I didn't. What I said is, if there's a material change, I said that what people are most concerned about is migration, rightly in my view. Now, if we get a material change, that, for example, Europe actually offers us something on free movement, I can see a Prime Minister thinking, that's enough of a gain for the nation
This
to
is
put
what
it
happened
to
to the Danes and the Irish, isn't it? They said no, so there was a bit of tinkering in Brussels. We'll put the question to them again because there's been a material change. And guess what? They voted as they were expected to.
What if we're sitting here, for example, February, March, April next year, and we've had another vote, and actually the majority this time for Remain on the New Deal is 8% or 10%? Is that more or less democratic? I would argue that's equally democratic.
We can't trust the polls anymore, though, can we? We know we can't trust the polls. So
well, nobody can trust the polls, which is part of the point. All I'm saying is how we realise this, what Brexit means. It's not clear, and it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't trigger Article 50 for quite some time, and it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't have a general election before we triggered Article 50.
And if there is a general election, you know, people will look to their laurels, people will think there are threats and there are opportunities. And I know, you know, people are asking for advice, aren't they? Potential leadership candidates seeking advice. You've seen this happening.
Yes, indeed. And a lot of Conservatives rightly recognise that actually what's gone wrong is we haven't delivered for, I don't like any of these terms, the poor, the working class, the excluded. Nobody has delivered for them in 30, 40, 50 years.
So what do you do? What does delivery look like?
Exactly, that's the question.
Like?
Well, the question has to be, we live in a world where if you're just dependent on wages, you are probably socially, economically insecure, and that's what the vote said. And people feel they're threatened. I've often met workers who are in factories, and thank goodness that we have minimum wage legislation that is now living wage. But people above that aren't seeing progress. They're not seeing their living standards increase, and they feel under threat. And until we in the West, and this is why Donald Trump is doing well in America, model of
We've got to be careful
capitalism.
about that read across from the UK to the US.
I don't think I think it's there, and I think it's as clear as day, and it's also read back into Europe. It's true in France. You can see the rise of Front National. It's true across Europe. Globalisation, modern capitalism isn't working for working people in the developed world. It works for the developing world, but not for the developed world. And now they're biting back because they haven't been dealt with, they haven't been catered to.
You can argue one of the manifestations is what Ian Duncan-Smith was saying only yesterday. He was reporting that he was seeing council estates with 80% turnout. Now, you can talk about that's, the anger of people who feel ignored, or you can say, democratically, that's fantastic. These are people who hitherto have felt deeply disengaged from the political process, and now they're engaged. And having got a taste for achieving a result that many of them presumably are happy with, they might like that taste and want to carry on. They'll continue to be engaged. And that's a new force in politics.
And that's what we need. We no longer have anybody representing the working class in Parliament. Labour just represents a cosmopolitan middle class in London, I would argue, and I think the evidence is there for that. And UKIP, rightly or wrongly, sees itself as potentially becoming the Labour Party for the working class outside London. Now, because we haven't had anyone representing the interests of the working class for probably close to a generation, that's the new politics. Now, people like Ian Duncan-Smith, Michael Gove, in my view, have tried and done very, very good work in doing that, but it's not enough. If you look at something that George Osborne was right about the Northern Powerhouse, but it's only about transport. We've got to do something at an unprecedented scale.
Can I just get you to go a little bit further north than the Northern Powerhouse? I was in the room with Nicola Sturgeon yesterday at Butte House, and she was saying Scots who voted to remain are forward-looking. And I asked her the question, I said, are you saying it naturally follows, therefore, that the Welsh and the English are backward-looking? Sort of edged around the question, rather. But the point is, we're getting this animosity potentially creeping in, aren't we now, in terms of what the SNP, what Nicola Sturgeon might be looking to do and achieve with a second referendum, and what the English and Welsh have opted for?
Well, here's the trouble. The trouble with referendum is it's single issue, when actually the nature of the problems we face are multiple. It's why general elections matter. Do those who voted for Brexit actually want to break up the union? I doubt it. I think the majority of Welsh and English people are desperate to keep the union together. And the trouble is, the threat of Brexit threatens the breakup of this amazing, transformative country we all live in.
Because Sir John Major and Tony Blair at length warned us. They said, if you vote for Brexit, you'll risk, in leaving one union, you'll also end up de facto leaving another one.
They did. But I think the feeling of being excluded and the feeling of pressure and the feeling of, my goodness me, we've got to take control. And remember, these people have been denied control for generations, was so powerful. And the evidence shows from the surveys, migration was their number one issue. I think when you look at it in the wider context, everything is still in play. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be like that, but it is.
Okay. Philip, got to wrap it up there. Philip Blond, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the result of